Hello, my name is Tom Horvath, and this is Common Misinformation about Addictive Problems. But we're going to start with some accurate information about attorneys, and then we will cover the rest of the outline that is on this slide. So I'll give you a moment to take a look at that. We're mostly going to be talking about language, but we'll also talk about the role of treatment and mutual help groups, whether there is something called real recovery, what should happen in treatment, who develops addictive problems, and how we could prevent addictive problems. Attorneys have been a group of significant interest, of course, to themselves, but also to the mental health profession. And this rather large study looked at both the substance concerns and mental health concerns of American attorneys. This was a large sample with almost 13,000 attorneys who completed a variety of surveys and gave us a fair amount of information about what was happening in their lives. So let's look at a few of these findings. Looking at substance use specifically in the past month, we found that quite a few attorneys drink, significant portion use tobacco, and there were also some significant numbers for other substances, as you can see, including stimulants and cocaine at 1%. The Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, the audit, is simply a screening questionnaire for alcohol problems specifically. And in this comparison, we see whether if you're at a private firm or you're a judge, you've got a significant difference from highest to lowest there, but also associates to partners and time in practice. So there were some differences across the profession with respect to one estimate of drinking problems. Now we're looking at findings for substance use on a weekly basis. And as you can see, weekly usage is mirroring yearly usage, although at a slightly lower rate. Those using stimulants had the highest rate of weekly usage. And this doesn't tell you who's using, but simply how often they were using on a weekly basis. So I want to read this discussion slide. The audit, again, is the screening test. It screens 20.6% of the sample, a positive audit score. In comparison, 11.8% of a broad, highly educated workforce screened positive on the same measure. Among physicians and surgeons, 15% screened positive on a subscale of the audit C, which focused on quantity and frequency, whereas 36.4% of the attorney sample screened positive on the same subscale. This is starting to lead you to the conclusion, which you may have already known, that attorneys have more drinking and presumably more drinking problems than some comparable professions. And this was also a very concerning finding. While rates of problematic drinking in our sample are generally consistent with those reported in a 1990 study, in their study, attorneys, 18% in both cases, we found considerably higher rates of mental health distress. So that's only in the last almost 30 years, a significant increase in mental health distress in attorneys. One of the other issues they surveyed was barriers to getting help. To quote again, the two most common barriers were the same for both groups, and they're referring to people who have gone to treatment and people who were thinking maybe they should. Not wanting others to find out they needed help, 50.6% and 25.7% for the treatment and non-treatment groups, respectively, and concerns regarding privacy or confidentiality. Confidentiality is a major issue when someone has substance problems, and we will return to that concept. I don't know that these numbers are much different in the general population. Confidentiality is a major concern for everybody. So that was a scientific study. This is the report of a task force from the American Bar Association. Also a substantial effort because they ended up with recommendations across a wide range of stakeholders. But the bottom line for all of these stakeholders was anything that enhances a lawyer's sense of self-control, and I emphasize sense of control, is what's going to be helpful. Because there are many situations where we cannot control the situation very well, but perhaps we can control our perspective about it. And in case you did not know that it exists, there is a lawyer assistance program through the California State Bar and through other state bars, I believe throughout the entire United States. And I have interacted with them modestly over the years, but I have had many good reports about the work that they do. So now let's move on to what I have characterized as misinformation or inaccurate information. Now, no piece of information typically is entirely accurate or entirely inaccurate, so I'm going to try to sort out what's accurate here from what isn't. My little bit of time in the courtroom persuades me that when an argument from one side or the other can acknowledge the valid points of the other side, it tends to be more effective than an argument that seems to berate the other side entirely. So I think these are the beliefs that have given rise to a lot of the misinformation that we see, at least in the United States, about substance problems. The first is that someone either is an alcoholic or addict, or possibly both, or they're normal, a normie. The second is that addiction is a disease and is largely genetic, and that applies to everybody who has substance problems. If you've had substance problems, you are then either in recovery or not in recovery. And if you are using medications to help you make change, then you're not in real recovery. And in order to be in real recovery, you need to have attended treatment and gone to 12-step groups, and that 12-step groups are essential for maintaining your recovery. Now, I want to point out that there are several prominent examples of all or none thinking in these beliefs. They tend to ignore situational factors and the reality of human diversity. Ironically, these perspectives at the top of the slide promote stigma about addictive problems, which is, ironically, what people with addictive problems would like to move beyond. The term stigma in its original usage is a mark. It's a brand marking that you would put on your steer or on your slave millennia ago, in which you identify something as yours. It's different from the average thing, and it is therefore easy to distinguish. As soon as someone says, I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic and I am different than other people, that stigmatizing process allows for the creation of prejudices against that person. It allows for stigma. I'll add that these issues are not worth arguing about with someone if the person you're talking to has addictive problems and is dealing with them successfully, or at least attempting to. If a person's approach is working, life is complicated enough, and since we don't understand any of this perfectly, if somebody's got something that's working, we should probably leave well enough alone. And in this picture, I capture some of human diversity. The picture would probably be even better if we had a broader range of ages and a broader range of styles and clothing. But it's a reminder that because people are so different, there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. So let's begin by looking at the language of addictive problems and the language of change. And I want to invite your attention to this manual. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, now in its 5th edition. This is DSM-5. It was published by the American Psychiatric Association in 2013, and its use became official in 2014. Part of the significance of this book is that starting with the release of the 3rd edition in 1980, so 41 years ago, the terms alcoholic and addict went out of the professional terminology. So for now 41 years, anyone who's using those terms, addict and alcoholic, is using terms that don't belong in the diagnostic manual anymore. In the 3rd and 4th edition, they talked, for instance, about alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence. In this 5th edition, we talk about substance use disorders. So let's now come to the continuum of addictive problems. And there is that term, substance use disorder, right at the top from the DSM-5. But I invite your attention to run down the right-hand column. I have divided the range of addictive problems into 6 segments. If we focus on alcohol for a moment, we have abstainers, and I'll call them near abstainers. These are people who might have 1 or 2 drinks a year or something on that order. The next category is moderation. This, by definition, is drinking, but with no significant problems. Every time you engage in one activity, you have an opportunity cost regarding other activities, but moderation is, generally speaking, of little or no significance, negative significance to someone. Let's jump to the bottom of that column, and we have severe substance use disorder. In the old diagnostic manual, that would be called dependence or even addiction. But here, it's severe substance use disorder, and a professional can make that determination based on 11 criteria that the diagnostic manual indicates. In fact, the criteria are the same for mild, moderate, or severe, and it just depends on how many of those criteria you meet to have a diagnosable disorder. I left out subclinical use. That's the 3rd one down from the top. This is more problems that arise with moderation or the beginnings of problems, but not quite enough to reach the level of a diagnosable disorder. This term, this segment, has multiple names, including risky use, harmful use, high-risk use, subclinical or problematic use, or misuse. I'm calling it here subclinical to indicate that place between moderation and the diagnosable disorders. So I want to make a couple more comments on the next slide about this continuum. This continuum can be used to describe someone's standing on all substances and all activities. So activities, I'm thinking about gambling, video games, shopping, pornography, sexual activity, etc. And those have been called activity addictions or behavioral addictions or process addictions. We don't really have a good term because all addictive problems involve activity and behavior and process. Each substance or activity has its own place on that continuum. So if I'm a heavy drinker, I'm going to be towards the bottom of what's listed there, perhaps a diagnosable disorder. If I don't use cannabis at all, then I'm an abstainer. If I don't gamble, then I'm an abstainer. If I occasionally smoke a cigarette, I may be a moderate cigarette smoker. Every substance or activity, and there are hundreds of them if we start counting them all, has its own place. Secondly, that place can fluctuate over a person's lifetime. Just because you are in one of those segments today doesn't necessarily tell us anything about where you're going to be in the months or years ahead. And because there are so many different substances and activities that someone could be involved in, for most of us, abstinence or near abstinence is where we would be for most of these. And I want to emphasize the hard to predict aspect of this. We don't know where you'll be in the future. Wherever you are now on which specific substance or activity, that doesn't tell us necessarily where you'll be in the future. Which specific substances, if we just restrict ourselves to that, will be pleasurable. If you like alcohol, does that tell me you like cannabis? I have no idea. If you like cocaine, will you like meth? I have no idea. If you like opiates, will you like benzos? Again, we don't know. Additionally, where you are on the continuum will not tell you much about the specific symptoms that you might be manifesting. So for instance, someone can have substantial legal problems from drinking, like DUIs, and no medical problems, or vice versa, or substantial social problems, but none of the previous two, or occupational problems, and so forth. So although the continuum is very important for understanding where someone is there's still a great deal of information that is yet to be gained. And the continuum, particularly the potential for standing on it is or change of standing on it, is different than the traditional disease model where once you have the disease, you've got it for the rest of your life. It's not how the diagnostic manual works. It actually hasn't worked that way since 1980. And just in case you need a reminder about the kinds of things you might have temptations for, and a reminder that if we really like something, we would like to do even more of it. Can one desire too much of a good thing? Probably not. Okay, so this leads us to some conclusions about how to talk about addictive problems. If you're trying to speak in a professional manner and make reference to the DSM, then the terms addict and alcoholic would not be appropriate. Now, I said there's a kernel of truth in everything. If you are a 12-step member, such as Alcoholics Anonymous, or you are referring to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, ASAM, definition of addiction as a disease, then those terms would be fitting, but they don't fit the DSM-5. Now, the notion, moving on, that addiction is a disease has been perhaps, along with whether moderation is possible, but they're connected issues, probably one of the two most controversial issues in the field. Many people paying attention to just what's stated in the media would reasonably conclude that the issue is settled. But it is far from settled in the professional and the scientific community, despite what you read in various seemingly authoritative sources. I believe that the compromise position is that if someone has addiction as a disease, they would necessarily be diagnosable as having a severe substance use disorder, and even individuals who have that diagnosis do not necessarily have the disease, but certainly the notion of an individual having a disease does not apply to someone who is any place else on that continuum, a fact that even the big book acknowledges when it talks about moderate drinkers and hard drinkers who have problems but don't actually have the disease. And I'm quoting from a 2013 publication. It would be even stronger now. We conclude that it is not necessary and may be harmful to frame addiction as a disease. Some of the harm that comes from this framing includes the increased likelihood for stigmatizing, the distraction that occurs because now people, rather than thinking about what are my problems and how do I solve them, they get distracted by the question, do I have a disease or not? And if they conclude that they don't have a disease, which is actually a reasonable conclusion for many people, then they decide they don't need to do anything about it. So those are just two examples of insistence upon a disease being actually counterproductive. So rather than trying to diagnose the presence of some mysterious or even mystical entity inside the person, diagnosis via the DSM is based on the presence of problems. And again, the manual identifies 11 types of problems, and if you reach a high enough level on each one, you're understood to have met that criterion, meet at least 2 of them within the same 12-month period, and you would qualify at least for a mild substance use disorder. And I emphasize again that quantity and frequency are not part of the diagnostic criteria at all. So if someone comes to me and says, well, my partner must be an alcoholic because he drinks 8 beers a day, and I had such a case once years ago, and upon examination discovered that this was a gentleman who was retired and spaced his 8 beers, he freely acknowledged it, over the course of an entire day. And although it's maybe not the most healthful way to consume alcohol, he never had a high blood alcohol level. He had no problems. He worked in his garage with heavy equipment, among other things, and as he stated to me, I'm just as fond of keeping my fingers as the next person, so I have no intention of getting intoxicated. And it reminded me of something I had read even earlier, that prior to the development of safe public water supplies, most people had some level of blood alcohol level going all day long, because that's how you consumed safe beverages, cider, beer, wine, etc. So apparently the problem with drinking is mostly binges or high levels of alcohol as opposed to lower levels. So when you're talking about addictive problems, I suggest you say substance problems or addictive problems or alcohol problems or cocaine problems specifically. And if you want to use the diagnostic manual, then you'd talk about a substance use disorder or alcohol use disorder. There are about 10 such substance use disorders. Stimulants, opiates, cannabis, or some of the others. So let's shift our attention now to the role of treatment versus what I'll call natural change or natural recovery. As it turns out, most individuals who resolve substance problems do so entirely or primarily on their own, many of them simply by growing up, maturing out, as we say, becoming more involved with responsibilities of job or children. And it points to the reality that treatment is not essential for change. What is essential in most cases is that people actually make a decision that it's time to change, and then they begin doing that, self-guided change. But sometimes change occurs almost by happenstance, perhaps because somebody has a new partner, a new job, a new home. This is the reality of how change typically occurs. But as you might imagine, if you're in the rehab business, promoting that idea is not good for business. Consequently, when you see ads for treatment facilities, they'll say things seemingly helpful, like, Well, if you don't get treatment with us, make sure you get treatment with somebody. And what would be better to say is, if you have addictive problems, maybe it's time to think about them and start making some changes. Now, on the other hand, I am a psychologist and I make my living some forensic consulting, but primarily by treating individuals with addictive problems. So what do I tell them? I tell them that coming to see me is like going to see your accountant to file your tax return. If your tax return is relatively simple, you may not need an accountant. If it gets more complicated, you can still figure it out, but you might spend a lot of time doing it. If it would be worth your time and money to speed up the process, then coming to see me and my colleagues might make sense for you. We can also help you address other related problems, and I'm thinking anxiety, depression, relationship conflicts, trauma, bipolar disorder, etc. Treatment can also be helpful if someone is back up to the wall, so to speak, particularly with a partner or an employer where there's little room for error. This is what you might want to do when you're on some version of a last chance agreement. Now, I want to give you one example that won't require you to go to the scientific literature to help make sense of this idea, because it may not swallow well that treatment is not necessary for change. I want you to consider cigarette smoking. In the United States, at this point, tens of millions of people have quit smoking. In the 1960s, before the first Surgeon General's report about smoking, it was nearly half of the population that smoked cigarettes. We're now down to around 15%. The number keeps dropping quite quickly. I assume you know that there's actually one small rehab devoted to getting off cigarettes, but it's not something you'd go to the Betty Ford Center or other place to do. Basically, if you're ready to stop smoking cigarettes, you do it on your own. You don't go to treatment. There are some medications that can be helpful, although they haven't actually improved the rate of success as far as I know. So you might say, well, okay, quitting smoking, but that's not the same as quitting alcohol or other drugs. Everybody knows it's easy to quit smoking. But in fact, everybody knows it's not easy to quit smoking. There are scientific studies that look at people who have quit smoking and quit cocaine, or quit smoking and quit heroin. And we asked them, which one did you like more? Well, you can guess. It was the cocaine and the heroin. Which one was harder to stop? More often, it was the smoking. So I'm suggesting to you that from your own knowledge of the world, you can help validate this notion that even if stopping an addictive behavior was difficult, it is possible to do it without attending treatment. And again, treatment can be helpful and maybe worth doing, but it should probably not be the first option that people think about. And now we're going to turn our attention to mutual help groups. I've got one pictured here. This is actually a Smart Recovery meeting. Mutual help groups are also known as self-help groups or support groups or mutual aid groups. They all function in some similar ways. The oldest of them currently, although these groups actually go back hundreds of years, none of the ancient ones are still in existence, but AA started in 1935, is the leading organization of its type, and there are now several dozen other so-called 12-step groups. They're 12 steps because they have 12 principles or steps that one goes through in order to change. So Alcoholics Anonymous started in 1935 and really unchanged since, was a very good effort for 1935 to address these problems. And part of what they put in place was a spiritual approach which never needs to change. Those can be unchanging. And also a fellowship. And it turns out that the fellowship is the most curative or therapeutic aspect of AA, as apparently it is for some of the other mutual help groups, a few of which I've listed here. They are all effective, as far as we can tell at this point, the research is ongoing, because of community. And this has a parallel in psychotherapy. So psychotherapy has been around, let's call it 100 years. And at this point, depending on how you count, there's at least 300 approaches to psychotherapy. By one count, there were several times more than that. And despite the hopes of the founders of each one of these forms of psychotherapy, it's been very difficult to show that any one approach is more effective than any other approach in any consistent way. And not only has that been studied in general, but it's also been studied in terms of specific issues, including anxiety, depression, trauma, and substance problems. What does seem to make a difference across all the psychotherapies is that the therapist and the client are working on the same goals, that the client feels understood and supported, and that the therapist comes across as a genuine and real person. If those things are in operation, it doesn't much matter whether you're in psychoanalytically oriented psychodynamic psychotherapy, behavior therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, Gestalt therapy, or any other one of the hundreds that I could list. So the finding about mutual help groups, this was finally published in 2018, being equally effective is consistent with the finding in psychotherapy where there are hundreds of studies to validate that idea. One other point about mutual help groups which will be of interest to attorneys is that the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment, Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibit the free exercise thereof. According to that portion of the First Amendment, it is illegal for the governments to mandate that someone attend AA or any other 12-step groups because the groups have been ruled religious enough that it would be a violation of that clause. Now, that's actually had some teeth to it because in a case in 2007 in California, Hazel versus Crowfoot, the award for damages was $1 million from the state of California to Hazel and $1 million from the treatment center that insisted on keeping him in 12-step oriented treatment. But that's only of interest if you find yourself in that situation. The point is that if someone is ordered to attend a mutual help group, fine. Ordered to attend AA, no. And it does not mean, therefore, to come to the bottom line on this slide, that AA is the best mutual help group, although it might be the best for a particular individual, or that it is the only way to recover. Another phrase that has come up in traditional approaches to addiction treatment and change is that someone is in real recovery or not. This is one more example of all or none thinking. Rather, we should think of change as occurring by successive approximation across a number of small steps. It is true that after a crisis, people can make a dramatic change. That crisis could be liver problems, a DUI, a major fight with a partner, and so forth. But the reality of life is that it would be better to avoid the crisis to start with and make your change by smaller steps. When you're needing to deal with someone who has addictive problems, it's better not to precipitate a crisis, which is sometimes done, but rather to simply provide natural consequences. So a partner might say, I don't like you when you're drinking. When you drink, I'm going to leave the house and I'll come back later. I'll go spend the night someplace else because you're not fun to be with when you're like this. That would be a natural, normal consequence that arises from the situation. So part of the implication of this then is that there are many roads to change. They can include medications, the self-guided change we talked about earlier, the various types of treatment that one might seek, and making other life changes. And the notion that if you were in real recovery, you now no longer had anything to do would be wrong. I assume none of us have reached perfection and that we're all attempting to improve our lives as we go, which is the same thing for individuals with substance problems. So now let's look at treatment a moment. The ideal focus in treatment is on underlying and related issues. I've already mentioned anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, trauma, relationship issues. Addictive behavior is often a coping method for those issues. If you expect the addictive behavior to go down, you probably need to improve the capacity for coping. Ideally, if someone is in treatment, from my perspective, they would work with licensed professionals, meaning a master's degree minimum. In the mental health system in the United States, that is the case, although there's room for other types of workers. In hospitals, we certainly have practical nurses, LVNs, in addition to regular nurses, physician's assistants in addition to physicians, and so forth. But because addictive problems can be life-threatening problems, it makes sense to have high-level professionals, not just individuals who are drug and alcohol counselors. I assume that when I'm speaking to attorneys, you recognize that a paralegal and a legal assistant is a very important part of a practice, but is not somebody who should do the heavy lifting on any important legal case. The 6 items that I've listed here are the main things that one would pay attention to in treatment. Different people will need a different focus on each one. Motivation, craving, problem solving, relationships, lifestyle balance, a sense of meaning and purpose in life. The exact setting of treatment could be very different. Sometimes I've done couples therapy the whole time or family therapy. Some people only come to groups, some only individuals, some a mixture of all of those. That's very much guided by individual preference. One of the other striking findings that's been in the literature since the middle 1980s is that there is no evidence that residential treatment is more effective than outpatient treatment. Again, this is not good for business for the rehab industry, so it's not been publicized. There is a role for medically supervised detox when someone has certain kinds of physical dependence on substances. That can be done in some cases outpatient, some cases a residential facility, in some cases a full hospital is needed. So to return, most do not need treatment. If you do, for most, outpatient is sufficient, and that treatment could be psychotherapy with a psychotherapist rather than something that officially gets called addiction treatment. Along the principle of small steps and harking back to the importance of confidentiality, if you want to get a private, relatively inexpensive assessment, I think it's under $100, of your alcohol or other substance problems, you can go to this website, checkupandchoices.com, and also get some online treatment, which is evidence-based. If you want some good self-help books, I would go to the Association for Behavior and Cognitive Therapy.org, abct.org. Self-disclosure, my self-help book is one of the ones listed there. There are online meetings such as Smart Recovery or more 12-step oriented meetings in the rooms, which you can find online. And these meetings can be accessed in a way to preserve your confidentiality. But to remind you, more important than treatment is the decision to change. So in order to support some of this, let me run through a few things you might want to know. If you are coping with craving, the desire, the urge, whatever you call it, it's important to remember 3 things. Each craving is time limited. It's going to go away. The set of cravings typically goes away after about 3 months, maybe not entirely, but largely. The craving itself is not harmful to you. It's very uncomfortable, and quite distracting, but it doesn't actually do any damage to you. And most importantly, it does not force you to do anything. If craving or hunger or desire forced us to do things, no one would ever be able to lose weight, among other issues. So the implication of these facts is that when the craving comes up, whether it's 1 on a 10-point scale or 10 on a 10-point scale, you wait it out, because it will go away, and you engage in other activity until it does. So, who develops addictive problems? A study done here in San Diego a couple of decades ago now at Kaiser, with a large N of 17,000, I think, looked at 8 and then eventually 9 adverse childhood experiences that someone could have. And these included significant consequences like being removed from your parents, sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and so forth. And to summarize what's now a very large set of studies, as these ACEs increase, many behavioral and health problems increase as well. So this has huge implications for prevention, which we'll get to in a moment. Those who have high levels of willpower, meaning the capacity to focus on long-term consequences, which could be harmful, even though you want to do something right now, those who have that capacity don't develop addictive problems. Those who are more impulsive, if those impulses go along with substance problems and substance use, that do-it-now mentality, they do tend to develop addictive problems. If you've had many adverse childhood experiences, you often live life with a high state of internal tension most of the time. And the reality for many of these individuals is that getting intoxicated can, in the short run, be a very good decision in the sense that it's a way to calm down. And when you see someone with that kind of background who is trying to change and abstaining, and you see the tension in them rising, you can see the return to use coming because they don't yet have a way to reduce that tension by other methods. There are also emerging methods that don't focus on willpower, but focus on the development of pro-social emotions. I'll simply mention them now. Many people have already discovered that keeping a gratitude journal is a way to reorient your whole life, but also focusing on compassion and authentic pride reorients your entire life and your connection with other people. So for this slide, the bottom line is that there is a strong psychosocial or psychological component to addictive problems, and part of the other conclusion is that that's at least as strong as genetics, and both situational change and personal development can be useful for preventing these problems or resolving them. So if we were to truly get focused on preventing addictive problems, we would do what we could to reduce adverse childhood experiences. Now, that would require a very substantial change in how society operates. And whether that's likely or not, I'll leave to you to decide. When somebody already has addictive problems, however they have arrived at them, we need to provide meaningful alternative activity. If you have someone growing up in an impoverished environment where there is not economic opportunity or not opportunities for, let's say, healthy pleasures, it's not hard to imagine that someone ends up using substances and becoming a drug dealer as well. Our public health messages could emphasize the importance of self-management rather than addiction as a disease, and that would also it would educate the public about how to deal with addictive problems as they start to emerge. One example of that would be moderation training for alcohol. So let's go into a little bit, if you were going to be dealing with yourself and resolving your own addictive problems, I'll call this Self-Treatment 101, let's talk about the kinds of things you would do. One of the most basic tactics is to conduct a cost-benefit analysis. It might be helpful to talk with someone you can take into your full confidence, but it's not essential. The most important question to ask in the cost-benefit analysis is, what do I like about this substance? You also don't need to think about every substance in your life, only the problematic ones. You don't need to commit yourself to abstaining or even reduction or moderation. This is just an exploration. If you go to checkupandchoices.com, they will do that there. There are many places to do this. But the first question is, what do I like about it? What does it do for me? To take a very simple example, if I drink to relax, as many people do, but I'm also concerned about the problems, then finding other ways to relax becomes a crucial piece of how to move forward. If drinking is the only way you have to relax or the only way to socialize, and you remove that, your life is going to get worse. And most of us don't willingly want to make life worse. We'd like to make life better. So before you jump across that abyss, you could spend some time developing your capacity to reduce your tension, to socialize, or whatever else your substance does for you. Now, when you're doing that, I talk here about exploring basic changes. Sometimes just putting a limit in place for yourself. The limits are typically around quantity and frequency. So I'll only drink on the weekends. I'm going to stay focused on alcohol because it's the most common issue, but this applies to all other substances and all other activities as well. I would only have so many per day or drink only so many per week. The moderation guidelines that have been promulgated by several organizations suggest that 14 standard drinks a week for a male is a good maximum, and 7 for a female. Now, based on the data we saw at the beginning of this slideshow, there are a lot of attorneys who are far exceeding those numbers. But for health and for well-being, if you can stay within those numbers, you will be doing better. And one set of moderation guidelines allows for more than 2 drinks a day for a male, but assumes some days of abstaining, and in another set of guidelines, it's 2 drinks per day. If you're going to be cutting back, you will need to engage in other activities. So just to go home and think, I'm not going to drink tonight, is probably a setup for not doing well. It's rather, I'm going to go home tonight and do this, and as a result of that, I won't be drinking. There are some substances that lead to physical dependence. Alcohol is the biggest concern. If you have been consuming, and I can only be general about this, enough quantity for a long enough period of time, you could start to have withdrawal symptoms. Fortunately, everything you know or need to know can be found on the internet, and you can taper over time. Could be as fast as 2-3 days, could be several weeks, such that you don't need to go into a hospital. It's possible for almost anybody, even at severe levels of alcohol consumption, to taper at home and to do it safely. People have been doing this for millennia, so it's not really a radical idea. But ideally, you would consult a physician. Over the years, I've had many clients who were not even willing to tell their own physicians about what was going on, so they took care of this themselves, and it is possible. So let's continue with Self-Treatment 101. And I have already said that working on new ways to cope is an essential piece. Often it is the primary task. Earlier I mentioned 6 tasks that can be included in addiction treatment: motivation, coping with craving, solving other problems, and that's this one, improving lifestyle balance, living with meaning and purpose, and improving relationships. So solving problems, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, etc., whether you're doing it on your own or in a treatment setting, that's where most of the effort needs to be made. So let's talk about willpower a moment. Willpower is the capacity to look past what you want to do right now and to think of the longer term consequences. But a large amount of scientific evidence suggests that, in fact, none of us are very good at it for very long. And the best way to deal with it is actually to keep yourself out of situations in which willpower is needed to start with. Focusing on gratitude, compassion, and authentic pride can help. But often, particularly in the early stages, until something becomes a habit, simply avoiding difficult situations is a very basic but very effective strategy. This idea goes all the way back to Aristotle, and it really hasn't been improved upon. Excellence is much more about developing habits than it is about engaging in intense effort in a particular moment. Those who are excellent develop habits over time, and then the habits carry them through. So yes, you have willpower. Yes, you can use it. Use it as little as possible, and rely instead on managing your environment in order to manage yourself. So I repeat that. Manage your environment so that it will manage you, and you will have a much easier time of all kinds of changes, not just addictive behavior changes. We've already talked about craving. Expect about a 90-day transition. And when we talk about building lifestyle balance, we're looking at balancing alone time and social time, work time and play time, intense activity with more relaxing activity. What lifestyle balance in the context of addiction means is that not only do I have momentary pleasures, but I am also preserving my life so that I have some long-term gains that are in process. So coming back to moderation for a moment, the technical definition of moderation is that blood alcohol level slowly rises to 0.05. That's 2 to 3 to 4 drinks, depending on your size, probably 2 or 3. Very small woman might only be 1 to 2. And above 0.05, substance problems or alcohol problems start increasing. By 0.08, you're a DUI. With a lot of drinking and a lot of tolerance, somebody can get to several times 0.08 and not even be identified as drinking, but there are physical consequences that arise as a result of that. Drinking is most enjoyable as blood alcohol level is rising. As you will see, if you think about it, you're going to be at the same blood alcohol level twice in any drinking episode, once on the way up and once on the way down. When blood alcohol level is decreasing, typically the experience is of no notice or even painful. But on the way up, it's enjoyable. So a good drinking episode, I suggest, extends that rise of blood alcohol as long as possible. You do that by some very simple things like sipping your drink rather than gulping it, and spacing the sips out so that you can feel the rise of BAL over time. Now, this is a broader perspective on this issue, but I've talked a lot about situational control, and on a day-to-day basis, it is probably the single best tactic that you can engage in for solving addictive problems. But ultimately, there will come times where you will need willpower, and in general, we want to create a society in which everyone has greater self-control about all kinds of behaviors. This is what distinguishes an adult from a child, a human from an animal, but we want to be clear that there are multiple ways to develop self-control. Okay, so I said that this lecture would be about misinformation. I hope that I have persuaded you that the terms alcoholic and addict are not going to be helpful, that they could be stigmatizing, and that you don't get any special credit for being someone who's not an alcoholic or an addict, and therefore a normie, that in fact, all of us have addictive problems at times. The fundamental drives that all of us have to cope with are for food and for sex and for the attention of others. And I have yet to meet a person who did not have some problems in one or more of those areas. And those are the problems that we have had since we've been human beings. In addition, there are all the substances and activities, and the number of them keeps increasing. There are more and more digital experiences to have. New substances are being developed every year. One year I read that the European Union had banned 50 additional substances that the garage and basement chemist had produced in order to evade substance laws. So there will be increasing temptation in the world, and all of us will need to deal with it. The idea that addiction is a disease, I have suggested, could be true. Many of us do not view it that way, but whether you do or you don't, it would only apply to a small portion of people. Those who could be diagnosed as having a severe substance use disorder, and not necessarily even them. And given the presence of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and their contribution, someone can have 10, 20 times the risk of substance problems with a high ACE score that they would without it. It's impossible to maintain the idea that genetics are the only contribution to substance problems. In fact, situation is at least as significant, and situation is what you can control. The idea that you are in recovery or not for those who are dealing with problems has been unfortunate because it's tended to decrease the recognition of the value of small steps, the recognition of the value of medications. There's a handful of medications that can be helpful in dealing with addiction problems. And in addition, there's a range of psychiatric medications that can help with anxiety, depression, and other problems. And these are worth considering. I'm not recommending for or against them, but in individual cases, on that individual process of building a pathway to change, they're worthy of consideration. As soon as we denigrate someone's pathway as being not real recovery, we get them off of the road that they need to be on. And rather, we should support that. This is, in recovery or not, one more example of all or none thinking, which is a classic problem in the addictive field. Finally, treatment and 12-step groups are not essential for change or for recovery. These, let me focus on 12-step groups first. They are a tremendous resource in the United States. They are almost universally available, almost day or night. There are people there who understand what addictive problems are about and can be quite helpful, and they are willing to devote their time at no charge to be helpful to people. It's a tremendous resource. Nevertheless, many people will not go to 12-step groups. They should not be forced to go. They should be encouraged to try them out if they want, or try other mutual help groups, nor should they be required to go to any kind of mutual help groups, nor generally should people be required to go to treatment even if their behavior needs to improve. I do a certain amount of family court work, and I almost never recommend that someone be required to go to treatment, but they could be required to abstain at all times or abstain at certain times. So the bottom of the slide lists what I think some of those problems with the misinformation include, and hopefully the whole slideshow has given you some implications of these beliefs, which all have a kernel of truth, but are more often than not an accurate description of what's going on. Thank you very much.